And here we go. Welcome everybody that's joining us.
I see the participant numbers going up.
Yeah, it's amazing how that happens. I know it is fun, isn't it?
Oh, hey, Betsy.
Saying hello to friends.
Bob Wells, a lot of familiar names on there. That's awesome.
Oh, you're seeing the names? I'm just looking at the numbers.
See, and I have to kind of stay off of it since I'm sharing my screen. I can't really, I mean, it won't show up, but I'd like to be clean about it here. So
it shows up as a gray box.
Yeah, not. So I'll pop in and say hi to people on the chat later. So I'm heading to Palisades Park, like literally park, tomorrow. Has anybody ever been there? It's I guess the border of New York, New Jersey, over by the George Washington Bridge.
Rye, New York.
You're going to Rye, New York?
No, that's where it is.
No, Rye? It's in New Jersey. It's an hour and 15 minutes from my home.
Oh, okay. So you're not talking about an amusement park.
Oh, maybe I'll go there instead. That sounds much better. I'm due for some roller coaster rides, right?
Sure, why not?
It's been since Tennessee, so I need that was actually last month's, that's why I missed last month's backyard forestry. So I was playing in Tennessee.
Did you go to Dollywood?
Of course.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yes. It was my first time.
Yeah.
And it was fun. It was definitely fun. So
Dolly Parton is a big supporter of the chestnut work. Her uncle Billy, who passed away last year, I think, was really into it. And so it kind of, in Eastern Tennessee is really big with chestnut. They're all over the place. It's really culturally connected. So she's written a song, "Oh Chestnut Tree." Song to the tune of Old Tannenbaum. I wouldn't say that it flew off the charts, but it exists.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Good to know. Yep, got to hike the Great Smoky Mountains.
Nice.
Which crossed that off the bucket list, so it was good. But I missed backyard forestry, and that's a first since we went to this virtual platform. So, but it was in good hands, right, Andy?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, the fellow who was helping with that last one, Kieran Hunt, is not going to be able to join us tonight, but Kieran's terrific. He's really a great asset to the forestry community and the Forestry Association.
Yeah, for sure. He will be missed. But he was the one, Sara, I think I was mentioning to you that we did winter tree ID.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously over the winter, and big hit. So
nice.
Yeah, good stuff. So I think we should get started so we stay on time. So welcome everyone who's joined us. My name is Lori Jensen, Executive Director of the New Jersey Forestry Association. We're glad you're here tonight. I'm glad to be here tonight. It's not Dollywood, but it's close. So just before we begin, got to do this little housekeeping thing. So at the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions. So you are welcome to actually submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation. So if you see something and you want a little bit more clarification, just pop it in the Q&A and we will address them at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, if you want to stop by and say hi to me or to Andy, you can talk to us in the chat at any time. We are recording this presentation as we do every month, so I will make that recording available in a follow-up email that you will get. If you experience any technical problems during the course of the webinar, if we can help you, you can put something in the chat. We'll see if we can help you. So I am now going to hand this presentation over to Andy Kim, our president. Hello, Andy. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, I see Elmer just joined us. Hello, Elmer. Okay, shall we get the other slides for me, Lori?
I do. There you go.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the August edition of Backyard Forestry. Another great session planned for tonight. We do have another one which will be September 16th. We do not have the topic yet. We're looking at a variety of different topics and presenters. So stay tuned. We will get you information on that as soon as it's finalized. So that'll be September 16th. Again, going back to some of the benefits of New Jersey Forestry Association membership, newsletters, website, the annual meeting, Woodland Stewards Program. This program, Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes, landowner representation, legislative monitoring. The New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program is an in-person, typically, program which we've held several years at the Camp Linwood McDonald YMCA camp in Sussex County, New Jersey. We did not have one the last 2 years because of the pandemic. This year's program will be, it's going to be a hybrid presentation. It's going to be 3 evenings, a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 2 hours each evening. And I believe it's the 21st, 22nd, 23rd of September. And then that Saturday, the 25th of September, will be the all-day program, which will be back at Linwood McDonald. There will be information coming probably next week. We'll get information on that. So another opportunity to learn a lot about forestry, what people can do to help protect our forests and manage our forests. So let's stay tuned. We'll get you more information on that. So for non-woodland owners, benefits, of course, fresh air, clean water, recreation, wildlife habitat, and forestry education, which is part of what this is. We have the backyard forestry, the woodland stewards. Those are some things we provide with forestry education. So it's a valuable program, not just for woodland owners, but for non-woodland owners as well.
Oops, sorry about that.
Okay, so forest stewardship. What is forest stewardship? You got some paragraphs here that explain what forest stewardship is from our perspective. From Pennsylvania, forest stewardship is the wise management and use of our forest resources to ensure their health and productivity for years to come. Going a little bit further than that, with the New Jersey Forest Stewardship Act, management of the forest and land and its natural resources shall be based on the principle of conservation. That is, the plan shall be designed to sustain the productivity of the forest, land, and its natural resources in perpetuity. So there's a big difference between New Jersey, Pennsylvania. They say years to come, we say in perpetuity. But that's what forest stewardship is all about here. So if you are not a member, I know we get a lot of people who are participating in these presentations. A lot of people are not members. We would like you to become members. By joining, it's only $55 a year. It gives an opportunity to take part in all of these educational enterprises that we come up with. And it allows us, the income from that allows us to get our newsletter out and do some other things that help with the stewardship of our forest.
And now it's my turn. So thank you, Andy, for that short recap there. And yeah, we'll definitely send information out about the Woodland Stewards Program. We're targeting for next week. We just want to get everything all finalized. So stay tuned. If you get our emails, you'll get an email about it. So it is actually my pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening. So Sara Fern Fitzsimmons has worked at Penn State University with the American Chestnut Foundation since 2003, assisting chestnut growers and researchers throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Born and raised in southern West Virginia, which we just talked about, Hinton, Sara studied biology at our very own Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. She then received a master's degree in forest ecology and resource management from Duke University's Nicholas School. I like this next part. After a short stint as an editorial assistant at All About Beer magazine, we should talk about that sometime because that sounds fun. Sara returned to the forestry field, where she has been ever since. Sara hopes her research and professional work will facilitate long-term conservation and restoration of native tree species at risk from exotic pests and diseases. Sara, thanks for joining us tonight. I will stop sharing my screen so you can begin.
Thanks very much. All right, let's hit that green button. And I will say, you know, working for All About Beer magazine was pretty fantastic. So that was during grad school. I was in North Carolina, and at the time, North Carolina only had the maximum limit of beer that you could have at the time was 6% alcohol. And so, but for the magazine, we could, by law, request samples of beers that were above that. And so that was like as all these really fancy breweries like Stone Brewing had Dead Guy, Rogue Brewing had Dead Guy Ale, which was like 6 to 8%, and all this stuff. So my job was to get all of the different beers that the reviewers would review, and I got to have fun with that. It was really amazing.
Kind of a dream job.
It was a dream job, and in Durham, North Carolina, we were right across the street from the old Durham Bulls Bar Park. It was a lifetime ago, though. So, I thank you guys for inviting me to give this talk. I really appreciate it. I always like to interact back with one of the places that I still consider home, since I did go to undergrad in New Jersey. I do try to get back as much as I can, and I still really have a great love for the state that taught me to love forest ecology, and where I really fell in love with it was the Pine Barrens. That's really what, because that place is so special ecologically, and kind of reminded me of West Virginia in a way. But it was really cool. So thank you guys. And I know I've spoken, I know many of you who are here in attendance, and I've spoken to the group before. So hopefully some of this, I'm going to cover some of the basics that some of you may already know, but I don't know that all of you guys know the background. So I am going to start with the background of the American chestnut, why it's important, what happened to it, cover the most recent scientific advances that we've made with a lot of our collaborators and partners, and then what we're going to do next, how we're going to actually get this species back into the woods. This picture here is one of my favorites. I'm afraid I didn't take it. This is from outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and it really kind of speaks to the charisma I think this species has. If you're not familiar with American chestnut, these spiny little balls, what I've heard called tree urchins, are chestnut burrs, and inside those chestnut burrs are 3 chestnuts. And you can see this burr right here in the lower left-hand corner of the tree. That one's just about ready to open up. So this picture was taken right at about harvest time, overlooking those beautiful mountains of Western North Carolina, where you can still find lots of American chestnut trees. The American chestnut, the native range is from Maine to Georgia, west into Indiana, a little bit of Michigan. You can see here most of New Jersey was covered, except that really extreme outer coastal plain down near Ocean City and things like that. It was a major component of eastern forest, fast growth, large, highly rot resistant. I love this picture here. You see that person in the red circle, and then just a tall straight bole, up to 60 foot. There's no limbs or branches, and that's really why chestnut was so prized, because it grew fast and had really great timber that was highly rot resistant. And then the nuts too, highly valuable for wildlife. I like to say that American chestnut is a jack of all trades. It's not the best at any of these things. It doesn't grow the fastest. It doesn't grow the biggest. It isn't the most rot resistant wood or the highest BTUs, but it has all of those things in one package. And I think I have yet to find another tree that does all of those things really well, and can provide all those uses in a single species. So we talked a lot about the wood. Obviously the nuts, here's some roasted chestnuts that someone scored, and they pop open and they're really tasty. You can see the split rail fences here. This is a picture from southwestern Virginia. Medicinal uses, they really do. There are tannins and other extracts that you can extract from the leaves and the nuts. Here's a chestnut leaf extract that was used as mainly as an antiseptic. And then I love this picture too. Hot chestnuts, good for the brain. Try a bag. So I think that's a good marketing angle for this person selling roasted chestnuts. And of course, the social and historical connections, chestnuts roasting on an open fire and all that. A question that I often get is, what are the chestnuts that you get in New York City, or even in the grocery store in the fall? Those are mainly European chestnuts. They're very large, and that's mainly what's imported into the U.S. That's starting to change as the U.S. is getting more and more of its own domestic industry for chestnuts, but we still import a lot from Italy primarily, a lot more than we currently produce. Before the blight hit, and we're going to get to what the blight is and what happened, but there were approximately 4 billion American chestnut trees in the eastern US, up to a quarter of the forest in some areas. People would say that the mountains looked like they were covered in snow in July, and that's because of what you see in this picture. These are the male flowers called catkins. The male flowers look like long fuzzy pipe cleaners. And then because chestnuts were so plentiful, especially in the mountain areas in the Appalachian Mountains, you could just see them all over the place. Those male flowers look like the trees were covered in snow, and the height of chestnut flowering is July 4th. Cryphonicary Parasitica, that's the scientific name of chestnut blight, and this is what it looks like. It's a very distinct disease, especially on young American chestnut sprouts. It's a sunken orange canker that doesn't really look like anything else in our forests. It's a fungal disease. The spores land on an opening in the bark. That opening can be as simple as where a branch is coming out of the tree. It can be where a bird lands on a branch and snaps it, and a spore gets in and a canker starts, and a tree this size in this picture, it'll be dead in less than one growing season. So it's highly lethal. Most American chestnuts have little or no resistance, and they get killed very quickly. What's important to know though is that American chestnut, chestnut blight does not kill the roots. So what happens, like most hardwood species, I'm sure you guys have seen this in your own woods. If you cut a hardwood tree down, they usually resprout. That's what happens with chestnuts. The main stem dies, the roots resprout, the main stem dies, the roots resprout, and you get this cycle occurring over and over and over again on many of these stems, and that's where the species is today. So the blight came in. It was brought in the mid 1800s on Japanese chestnut stock from the nursery trade. But it wasn't identified until 1904 in the Bronx Zoo. So that's where this map starts, 1904 Bronx Zoo. Even though there were burgeoning infections prior to that, by 1950 it had infected the entire range, and virtually every chestnut tree had become infected with blight. Here's just a really more of a close-up picture. You can see these spores. This is a very happy fungus and a very dead tree with the sprouts coming up at the base. And this is very typical of what you're going to find in the forests in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, well, throughout its range. This is a historical photo from Shenandoah National Park, and you can see the devastation of what these huge trees looked like that were so densely populated. Just these skeleton trees. We're seeing that today with things like ash, where you see these big stands of dead trees, and it was quite striking and pretty economically devastating to people, especially in the Southern Appalachians. Here's a picture of what you're going to find in the woods. Lots of dead stems here in the middle, lots of resproutings coming up. As long as the deer pressure isn't too high and you have some amount of release and some sunlight getting to these sprouts, they can do this virtually forever, we think, but deer can definitely do damage to them, and so can too much shade. The sprouts will exhaust in those two conditions. A common misconception about American chestnut is that it's extinct or endangered, and it's not. It's not threatened, endangered, or extinct technically. What we call it is functionally extinct. And that's because there are still lots and lots and lots of American chestnuts out there. So there are approximately 430 million American chestnuts still in the landscape. But, and there's a big but, 84% of those trees are less than 1 inch in diameter. And so we call it functionally extinct because the species can no longer perform its those ecological services that it once provided, particularly in nut production. You can still find trees fruiting, but it's relatively rare, and it's certainly not enough on a landscape scale to provide for wildlife and other things in the landscape. You see in New Jersey here, the biggest populations, the most dense populations are here in the northern area of the state, and that kind of makes sense. That's where a majority of the forest land are. We're having a real hard time finding trees in southern New Jersey. We have found them, but I'm going to make a little bit more point of that a little bit later on, but this is where we're really focusing some of our work on trying to find trees there in southern Jersey, particularly in those pine barrens where they used to be, and we can't find them now. Native species, again, we talked a lot about how American chestnut served so many different purposes. And I love this picture because it shows, you've got the pollen servicing the pollinators, bees, soldier beetles, things like that, insects eating the leaves, which then feed the greater food web in your insectivores. We'd commonly think about all of the mammals and birds and things that eat the actual chestnuts. That's really common. but why is a fish in here? And so fish are these aquatic larvae. One thing that you don't really think about is the decomposition of leaves and, the leaf litter that get into this nutrient cycling, and that feeds other things that you don't normally think about. And native species are really integral to feeding the greater wildlife throughout the forested ecosystem of the eastern US. So I always like to think about, what is it that our native species like American chestnut or ash or hemlock are doing beyond just, being in the woods and producing chestnuts or producing wood for us to use. There's a lot of dependencies there across the ecosystem. And American chestnut was a huge mass producer. I mean, I really think that's why it has its name. It's a chestnut tree, and it's also the chestnut nut. Here are the beautiful nuts from its burr. Here's what the chestnut female flower looks like. She looks like a little green pineapple at the end of June. You can see here chestnut production can far exceed that of white oaks. In that they can and often do fruit at a younger age. They tend to grow faster than a lot of their white oak counterparts, and they tend to produce annually. While that annual production does ebb and flow, it's not as cyclical as oak production. So you have dependable and plentiful mass production from chestnut. One estimate shows that the eastern forests lost as much as 30% of their hard mass production with the loss of chestnut, and that had to impact wildlife to a degree. The American Chestnut Foundation, who I represent the American Chestnut Foundation and Penn State. I'm an employee of both organizations, but the American Chestnut Foundation, TACF, was founded in 1983, and it with a few scientists and partners trying to figure out how to restore the American chestnut. It's grown now to 5,000 members, 16 chapters across the eastern U.S., and we have amazing partnerships throughout the eastern United States. Both actually in the U.S. and abroad. I've had the opportunity to travel to China a couple times. We have partners in Europe, obviously working with European chestnut, and it's really phenomenal the amount of effort that's going in to restore this tree and create a model of restoration for threatened native tree species. Our particular method has evolved over time, and our current process is what we call 3 BRR. We got 3 Bs: breeding, biotechnology, and biocontrol, and those 3 Bs are united for restoration. And I love this because the chestnut trees have burrs in which there are chestnuts, and there are 3 chestnuts. So we've got 3 Bs united for restoration, and there's a lot of different things that you can do under those 3 Bs. There's a lot of different traditional breeding techniques that you can do. There's obviously a ton in biotech that's going on right now, and biocontrol is one of the more difficult areas to work with, but that's still something, yet another element that we can use to attack such a huge problem like species restoration. So I'm going to go into all 3 of those a little bit more detail. Traditional breeding, I think, is what most people know the American Chestnut Foundation for. It was founded to do a backcross breeding program to try and introgress resistance from Chinese chestnuts into American chestnuts. This is a picture of a 6th-generation breeding program orchard at Penn State. You can see bunch of trees over here on the left, and not very many trees over here on the right. And so what we do is we plant thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of trees in these orchards to try to find the very, very few, the less than 1% of trees that have the right combination of growth habit, like an American chestnut, and resistance. And so you can see all these ones with the pink dots there. Those are the ones that end up on the burn pile. These ones here with the gnarly looking bark at the bottom, we take the blight, we put it in the tree, we see how well they fight it off, and if they do a good job, we keep them. So that's the traditional breeding program. It does take a long time. Tree breeding, I like to say tree breeding has a lot of job security in it because it takes such a long time. And it's hard to find a lot of immediate results. Here you can see, again, this is from the Penn State Arboretum, but you can see that really nice, tall, straight growing trees. The form, the architecture really does seem to be there. We do have resistance. What we're finding is that our resistance is not quite to the level of Chinese chestnut, which is what we had hoped. We're falling short of that goal, but we do still have some nice resistance. Here's a tree, we call this one, it's a snappy name, 32260. It's a block 3 plot 2, row 2, tree 60. This is one of our best trees. And again, I'll go back to this tree to this picture, and you can see these trees still get the blight, but they're fighting it. We've got trees that are approaching 15 inches in diameter. We've got trees that are over 50 feet tall in 20 years. So we've got really good growth. We've got highly moderate resistance, not quite Chinese chestnut level. What will these do in the forest? We currently have plots out there to try and figure out, is this going to be enough to do it? And if not, how much resistance do we need? But that's one leg. And then there are other breeding techniques that are going on, but this is the primary one that is the farthest along. We're also doing methods to try and improve that resistance. Can we get to Chinese level? Maybe, maybe not. Can we at least improve that even more beyond what we have? So we're doing lots of early stem inoculations that we can do in year 0 in pots. We're doing lots of genomic prediction modeling, so doing lots of sequencing of our trees to try and figure out what are the underlying genomic and genetic mechanisms that control blight resistance. All of these things can help us improve that aspect of the program. Interestingly enough, too, that stuff will also inform the biotechnology, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. Let's talk about the second B, the biocontrol. Again, biocontrol can involve a lot of things. And for example, questions in chestnut, are there things in the bark that allow certain trees to not get infected as soon as others? There do appear to be some mechanisms that might be fighting that, but at the moment, those are way too complicated to figure out. People are doing research on that, but it's a very complicated mechanism. So I'm not going to go into detail, but the most thing, the one that we have a lot of information on, and actually where one of the primary virologists at Rutgers, Brad Hillman, he's been working on this for decades, is hypovirulence. And one of the first places it was found was in New Jersey, in some plots near New Brunswick. And so you see the tree here on the right, you have a non-lethal canker. The tree on the left is uninfected bark. This is what mature. This tree on the left is probably about 40, 50 years old. This is what the bark looks like on a chestnut of that age. Here on the right, boy, it's gnarly, right? It's beat up. It looks real scabby, right? But that tree is able to fight off the fungus because the fungus is sick. And so that's effectively what's going on here. And you see this in these plates on the right, those really orange, deep orange isolates. They're highly virulent. They will kill the tree, like I showed in that first picture of a dying sprout. But these white isolates, these isolates that have the fuzzy stuff on them, they're infected with a virus. And so they're sick. And so that's the point, right? To make a fungus that's sick, you put it in the tree, and that way the tree, if it has any resistance, it can fight off that infection. There's a lot of issues that go along in there, but the whole idea is, let's get this virus out there. And we have a lot of experience now with viruses transmitting across huge populations. And so the hope is that we can figure out a way to allow this virus to spread throughout the current fungal population. There's some roadblocks there, but it's promising, and we're continuing to look at it and other biocontrol methods. The biggest talk of the town these days is biotech. And, I think I get the question all the time, why don't you just CRISPR? Why don't you just CRISPR or gene edit the chestnut tree? We would love to do that if we could. So a minute ago, I said, some of the genomic work we're doing is to try and figure out the underlying genes for resistance. And if and when we can do that, that's when you can start doing gene editing. If you don't know what to edit, then you can't genetically edit the tree. So first we have to figure out, what do we edit? What do we knock out or add or change in order to give the tree resistance? So we're on those roads. It's probably going to take a while for us to get there, but we're certainly going to look into it. And more than likely that technology is going to improve substantially over the next few years and allow us to implement it sooner rather than later. But eventually you have to figure out, what are you going to edit? And that's right now what our main roadblock is with that technology. Until then, the biggest biotech advance right now is genetic engineering. And so this particular, the most advanced of that, many of you have probably heard about Darling 58. And what it uses is an OXO gene. So the important thing to know about OXO, the reason that's used is because the chestnut blight fungus produces oxalic acid. It uses oxalic acid to kill chestnut tree tissues, and then the chestnut blight eats it. So the chestnut blight is what you call a necrotroph. It eats dead tissue. So that's why it produces oxalic acid to kill the tree so it can eat it. That's opposed to fungi that are called biotrophs that eat their hosts alive. I don't know which is worse. It's probably more humane, right, to kill your victim before you eat it. So in that way, we got a good guy. I don't know. So, but anyway, so it produces oxalic acid. This OXO gene produces oxalic oxidase, which neutralizes oxalic acid. This gene is from wheat. There are lots of similar analogous genes across the plant kingdom. There are hundreds of plants that have similar genes, not exactly this gene, but very similar oxalic oxidase genes as plant defense genes. So it's not uncommon to have something like this in a plant. Chestnuts have something that's pretty far removed. It's not exactly that, but there's something similar. But again, not to the degree that this works. So what our colleagues at SUNY ESF, the State University of New York's Environmental Science and Forestry program, they developed this, came up with the technique. Well, they didn't come up with the technique, they implemented the technique, say it with me, Agrobacterium mediated transformation. If you want some light reading tonight, I recommend looking up Agrobacterium mediated transformation. And what that uses is a bacterium, Agrobacterium tumefaciens, to get this gene, oxalic oxidase, into chestnut embryos. And that process takes a minimum of 18 months. You put them in these cute little tissue culture boxes. They look like little palm trees when they're in these boxes. You leave them there for a few months. You put them in the growth chamber, you let them grow up, and then you plant them out in the field. It's a long process. Trees grown this way don't like that. At least the chestnut trees don't like it, but they do grow. And the goal is to get these into the field, producing pollen in growth chambers, so you can get them out of that tissue culture element and into actual tree growth. So the most exciting advance is that the Darling 58, whenever you put a gene in a plant, that's called an event. And so if I put the gene in one time, that's an event. If I put it in another time, that's a different, even if it's the same gene in the same tissue culture medium or embryo, that's still a different event. So there's been Darling 4, there's Darling 15, there's Darling 39. The best one so far is Darling 58. And that's been studied the most. But as you guys are probably aware, genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms are a real hot topic. It causes a lot of really strong feelings. And it's also highly regulated by the US government, particularly the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA. So the most recent happening was that SUNY ESF submitted a petition to the USDA to deregulate Darling 58, the best OXO event that's happened to date. That public comment period opened up last August. It ended with 62% positive rating from commenters saying, yes, we support deregulation. That leaves, 100 minus 62 of those who were opposed or lukewarm to deregulation. The next step that the USDA is going to do is create an environmental impact statement, or an EIS. So this is going to take a couple of years, we think. They've told us it'll take 1 year, 2 years, they can extend it. So it's not going to happen immediately. But what this EIS, what they're going to do in that is say, what are the positive things that are going to happen with American chestnut, with Darling 58? What are the negative things that could potentially happen with Darling 58? And then they're going to make a decision whether or not to deregulate. The other regulatory agencies, EPA, FDA, have to make the same decisions, but it's not quite as involved as the USDA's decision-making process. Right now, there's something called a notice of intent up on the federal registry, and that is the most recent thing that has happened, saying, hey, we're going to write this EIS. What do you have to say about it? And so that's the most recent thing that's happened after that August to October public comment period. But we're still looking at some time before that's going to happen. So at this time, if you want to plant genetically engineered or transgenic American chestnuts, it has to be under a permit from the USDA. And these are fairly onerous to work with. They require a lot of different stipulations and guidelines, one of which is that you have to make sure that the regulated article does not escape in any way. And one way that you do that is you can't allow it to get more than 30 feet tall. You have to put a fence around it. You can't allow the flowers or pollen to escape. These aluminum screen bags are put over the flowers so that they don't get out or squirrels take them and plant them inadvertently. Obviously, our goal is to restore the American chestnut, to get it into the wild. We can't do that under these guidelines. So if we want to use this for restoration, we're going to have to get it deregulated. So while this petition was submitted by ESF, TACF stands behind it and is working very closely with a lot of different legal and governmental partners to try and work to get this deregulated. The biggest question that the regulators have is this safe? And obviously, I think that's what a lot of people who are concerned about these technologies, is it safe? Does this tree act different than a wild type or hybrid tree? And based on all the studies that have been done to date, no, it acts exactly the same. So this tree has oxalic oxidase. Could that have detrimental effects on mycorrhizal fungi? That's probably one of the biggest concerns, because it's sort of an antifungal agent. Will it inhibit colonization of mycorrhizal fungi? Several studies have shown no, it doesn't. What about our pollinators? Will it affect the pollinators? Studies on bee feeding on pollen, no difference. It does not affect the bees in a detrimental fashion. Same thing with tadpoles on leaf litter. No problem. Herbivores, insects on leaves, no difference. American chestnuts act like transgenic American chestnuts act like wild type American chestnuts. So that was part of the biggest petition. That was a big part of the petition that went into the USDA, trying to prove the safety of these transgenic American chestnuts. But that's the decision that the USDA and the EPA has to make. Is this going to be safe? Does this tree pose a plant pest risk? We say it does not, but they have to come to that conclusion themselves and have a lot of background material to substantiate it. A lot of that is to say, where do you guys fit in? I know you guys aren't going to have a lab creating transgenic American chestnuts or gene editing in your bathroom. I know that's not a place where we're at yet, but there are places where we need people with their boots on the ground or flip-flops on the ground, whatever you are out there with. One of the best ways that you can get involved with our program, and actually not just American chestnut, but other trees that are under threat, is to find remnant individuals, especially ones that are fruiting. This is a Chinese chestnut, but ignore that. If you can find American chestnut seeds, those are enormously useful for our program. But first you have to find the tree, right? And so there's a program out there called Tree Snap. If you love your smartphone as much as I do, I recommend that you download from either the Apple Store or Google Play the app called Tree Snap. And that allows you to find and catalog not only American chestnuts, but other tree species like ash, hemlock, white oak, Florida torreya. Should you be in an area where there's Florida torreya, not New Jersey, but somewhere else. And that gets to scientists who are working on all those species to conserve them and restore them. Once we know the location, like I said, we can either collect seed or we can collect scion and graft trees like here and preserve that diversity for long-term restoration. We would like to have about 1,000 different American chestnut of where we're really focusing and where we want the diversity and why that's important, particularly in New Jersey. But I do want to talk a little bit about once you get a disease-resistant tree and you get it in the landscape, we got a lot of other stuff that's going to be really difficult to overcome. So particularly in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, we've got explosive deer populations that make it really difficult to plant and grow trees. Lots of invasive competitors, multiflora rose, bittersweet, honeysuckle, mile a minute, which I fight on a daily basis. especially a mile a minute. Man, that stuff's brutal. There are other pests and diseases that are out there. Phytophthora cinnamomi, which is marching northward, sudden oak death, which keep it out west. Granulate ambrosia beetle, longhorn beetle, spotted lanternfly. We have no idea how much that's going to affect this project, but it just feels like you're fighting things a mile a minute. The last thing is that how do you restore a tree that used to cover 180 million acres, and what does that even mean? That just is such a huge area. So let's talk about some of that stuff. That's where you guys come in. Volunteer involvement. The Chestnut Foundation, we log over 25,000 volunteer hours per year, finding trees, planting trees, doing novel research, doing outreach and education, doing talks like this, just getting the word out, getting people excited to be a part of this kind of a project with tree restoration. And, you know, it doesn't just have to be chestnut. It can be, you know, our other native species that are under attack, but obviously I have a soft spot in my heart and wallet, I guess, for chestnut. That there's always a place for people to get involved. We do have training opportunities, much like Andy, you mentioned earlier that you guys do with NJFA. You know, there's lots of stuff, lots of ways that you can get involved to learn how to find trees, measure them, measure their impact. Here's some pictures of some volunteers doing an identification workshop to learn how to identify the difference between American chestnuts, Chinese chestnuts, Japanese chestnuts. I get all kinds of horse chestnuts. I get all kinds of stuff sent to my office in the name of American chestnuts, but we train other people to help us with that effort as well. So let's go back to this question of diversity. If we want to collect 1,000 trees from across the range and conserve them, where are they going to come from? You know, we definitely want them from a wide variety across the range. This is interesting. So I said, you know, there's 430 million trees. Most of them are very, very small. Most of them are not flowering. And you can see here that what I call the core, the heart of the range is here in Western Virginia, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee. This is one of the more interesting areas. And the far western part of the range where you see a contraction of the range where it used to be. So this outline is where the range used to be. Why aren't there trees in southern Indiana anymore? Why aren't we finding them there? Here in northern Alabama, why is it so hard to find trees there? Delaware, Maryland, southern New Jersey, they're there to an extent, but far fewer than they used to be. Actually, there's a lot of trees on Long Island too. They're not showing up there. But you know, one of our main questions is why are they being constricted on those edges of the range? And that is typically where you find unique adaptive complexes. On the edges of these species range is where you find unique adaptive complexes. And that's why, you know, for you all, you know, southern New Jersey in particular is going to be of particular interest, especially if we can find trees in the pine barrens where you have a unique ecosystem, trees that could potentially be adapted to very dry soils and maybe even have some fire adaptation. That could be of great interest to our diversification work of disease-resistant material. It's really difficult to conserve American chestnuts. I passed by this really quickly because if any of you guys have ever done grafting of like apples, it's relatively easy. Or if you plant poplar or willow, you just take like a stick and you put it in the ground and you have a new tree. You can't do that with chestnut. Grafting is very difficult. There's a lot of issues. That's the main reason I put up this slide. It's a lot easier if you can find fruiting trees. I love this picture too. This is find the flowering American chestnut tree. We have folks doing flyovers. This was in Maine. This is how they found 110-foot tall American chestnut tree in Maine, just by doing flyovers and like looking out the window and they're like, there's one. And that's how they found this really spectacular specimen, which is fruiting. And that's one of the easiest way to conserve trees. So we want to collect pollen, seeds, scion, graft them as much as we can, put them into orchards. So for any of you landowners who want to plant trees, obviously I think most people want blight resistant or disease resistant material, but we have a real need for people to plant wild type American chestnuts for this diversification work. And that's something that, you know, we can start next year. If any of you are interested in planting American chestnuts, that's a real need, especially if we can find some unique material in New Jersey and plant in a location. You know, we tend to plant about 100 in a location, so it's not a huge resource advancement. And we were just talking earlier, Andy and Lori, that this group visited our Lord Storling orchard with in Somerset with Somerset Parks. That's about 350 trees. I think maybe 2 or 3 acres up there. So if for those of you who are on that tour, so that's about 3 times the size that we normally recommend for these GCOs, for these germplasm conservation orchards. So that just to give you some sense of how much it takes to plant one of these things. So here again, I'm going to plug TreeSnap again. Go ahead and download it while I'm talking. I'll wait. Download TreeSnap, find some trees, take some pictures, tell us where some trees are. That's a big help. Go on a forestry scavenger hunt, go out with your local hiking club. It's a fun hobby to get into. So using TreeSnap, this is where we found trees so far. So there are quite a few trees in that Sandy Hook, Monmouth County area, quite a few trees up there. And then obviously up the Appalachian Trail up here, it's pretty stupid with chestnuts. And then throughout northern New Jersey, you can find them a lot. But I mean, this whole here is really noticeable. We don't expect to find them in that outer coastal plain, but we still do expect to find them, maybe down Route 206, into Wharton. I would expect to find them there. We haven't, but this is an area that could be ripe for trying to spot and find them. So, where do we find them now? Stoke State Forest, Wanacue Reservoir, the Sourlands, Middletown over there in Monmouth County, Mercer County Park, Jamesburg Park, again in Monmouth County. So you can find big locations. Here's a map of all the trees that are in Hartshorn Woods. Which is near the highlands. So there's 100 or so trees just there. So you can find them, and we could still use you finding these trees and collecting the nuts. Even if we know about the tree, go ahead and take that data, because we could always use. We knew what that tree was doing maybe 10, 15, even 20 years ago, but we'd like to know what that tree is doing today. So go ahead and take the data. Don't worry if we already have it in our logs. We'll use that information. This tree unfortunately has since died, but this is one of the biggest ones that we had on Sunfish Pond along the AT, and we had some people hiking the entirety of the AT and logging trees. So again, that's another really fruitful place to go and log information, so we can track how the populations grow and die back and resprout. And then again, finding trees, planting them. It's a lot easier for me to do this in an orchard, take a ladder on the back of a truck, set it up, rather than trying to drag it out to the Appalachian Trail and work on a tree out there, or then drag it all the way to Hartshorn Woods and work on a tree there. I'd rather take their kids and put them into my backyard or your backyard and work on all those trees in one place. It just makes the work a whole lot easy. What do these things look like? This is an orchard that was planted in 1983. This is called the Hahn Orchard. It's in Sandy Lake, which is up near Erie, Pennsylvania. This is winter. But these trees that have no resistance, these are wild type American chestnuts. You can see they look like hazelnut bushes, I think is the best way to describe it. And you can get tens of thousands of nuts. And this is one day's harvest from the Hahn Orchard. So there are a lot of reasons to plant American chestnuts that have no resistance, at least for diversification purposes. Even if you're really into early successional habitat, this could be a really great way to achieve that goal and have mass production in that type of a habitat. So we've been working with the migratory bird treaty work, golden wing warbler work, to plant wild type American chestnuts as part of those landscapes from a diversification element to keep that species going with no resistance, but it still serves a lot of those goals. For those of you into production, this is a commercial production intercropping chestnuts with raspberries, and I think that's really fascinating. This is in Michigan, so there are ways that you can get really creative with the species as well. Talking about habitat in New Jersey, this is using ecological land units of what's going to be suitable habitat for planting chestnut. Again, because where we find the most trees are up here in northern New Jersey, that's where you would generally expect the most suitable habitat to be. But we find a lot of suitable habitat in here. It's moderately suitable, but we find, like I said, we find a lot of trees out here in Monmouth County. The biggest limitation seems to be percent sand. And so we have trees planted at Jackson at the state nursery there in Jackson, and it seems to be just too sandy. So if you look at the soil survey, your web soil survey, if you're more than 75% sand, usually it's too droughty. The trees can't handle it. And that's probably why we're not finding trees in that Pine Barrens area. But if we could find a tree that's handling that, that could be really important from an adaptive, a unique adaptive complex that we could work within our breeding population. It could be really, really important. But if you have your land in any of these areas, mainly, you know, the northern part, up in the Ridge and Valley province and in the mountainous areas, that's where you're going to have your best bets. It's going to be the easiest to grow these things. That doesn't mean you can't grow them in southern Jersey. It just means it might be a little bit more difficult because of droughty issues or other considerations. That's another talk, though. We planted some trees at Cora Harsher and Arboretum. That's over near Short Hills. And so we've got a lot of these, you know, where do we do plantings? We've got research orchards. We've got plantings out in the forest to try and determine the long-term resistance and suitability of trees in the forested landscape. But we also have trees that we plant like in Arboreta as talking pieces. So we planted three trees at the Cora Harsher and Arboretum just for people to see and interact with the species, because it's been a long time since people came into contact with the species on a daily basis. We have over 500, the American Chestnut Foundation works with private landowners, NGOs, governmental organizations, you name it. We work with all kinds of different collaborators. We have over 500 research locations from Maine to Alabama, and it takes lots and lots of people to work on a program this big. And our hope is that eventually we see trees like this. This is one of the biggest trees that I've seen. This is in West Salem, Wisconsin. These trees are now, unfortunately, all blighted back. But this is what we really want to get to, is these huge, majestic trees creating all of these stems that you see here on the right are American chestnut. And hopefully one day we can get back to that. I mentioned a few minutes ago about and in the title I say 200 years. So what does that mean? How long is restoration going to take? And the native range of American chestnut is 180 million acres. I think it's really hard to conceptualize what that even means. How many seedlings do we have to produce to make an impact? How much of that original range do we have to do to make an impact? So this is my attempt to try and conceptualize that for you guys. So let's talk about how many seedlings are produced in the United States every year. So in the US, 1.2 billion seedlings are produced every year and planted across 2.5 million acres. That's annually. 82% of that number is planted in the southern US. You guys can probably guess, maybe put in the chat what you all think that species is. If 82% is in the south, 75% is bare rootstock. Did anyone get the answer right? I don't see anyone.
All right, let's see. I don't see anything in the chat right now.
Yeah.
Do you want to give them a minute before you?
I'll give a minute. You guys tell me what is the main species planted in the entire U.S. and this primarily in the South, and we'll see who gets it right. I'll move on. 5% of those trees was hardwoods. So most of what's being planted, I see the numbers going up. Magnolia, live oak, pine. Yes, pine. Anyone? I don't have the exact species on here yet. Shortleaf pine? No. It's loblolly pine is going to be your primary species. That's really, so it's yellow pine, primarily loblolly, sometimes these pitch lob, shortleaf lob combinations. But 5%, only 5% is hardwood tree. So, I mean, you can see how much of an uphill battle we're going to have planting hardwoods in particular. 22 million trees, 43,000 acres, 67% of those hardwoods were oaks. So what I usually say, okay, well, what is the production of chestnut? How much is chestnut going to be able to infiltrate that hardwood component? And let's just say 1%. So 1% of current hardwood production, seedling production, and hardwood planting is tulip poplar. Let's say at some point we'll get to 1% of production with chestnut. Let's just use that as a starting place. All right, here's a really cool picture. This is Michael French with his truck filled with American chestnut seedlings. That looks like a lot, but it's not. When you start looking at the scheme of things, let's assume 1% of current seedling production, covering 431 acres per year, only 220,000 trees per year, planted at a rate of 550 trees per acre, that's a pretty dense. We could probably get away with less than that. at that rate, if we produce 220,000 trees per year, which sounds like a lot, but we've never been able to do that, it would take us 2,000 years to plant 1% of the range. Okay, that sounds pretty Debbie Downer, right? Okay, but we can certainly do better than 220,000 trees per year. So let's say if we if we were able to plant 17,000 acres a year, we could get 1% in 40 years. Okay, that's pretty good. We could do it in 50 years if we were planting 22,000 acres a year. That may or may not be doable. So the hardwood plantings, but if you look at that, that'd be half of all hardwood plantings per year that's currently done. 43,000 acres is what's planted in all of hardwoods. So in order to do 1% of the native range in 50 years, we would have to have chestnut be half of all of hardwood production. So I don't know if that helps conceptualize how big restoration is going to be. Well, this is my joke, right? So restoration is going to take anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years, depending on how many trees you can create and plant out there. My take home for this, though, is that yes, we have to come up with disease-resistant trees. We've got lots of production that's going in. We do have trees going in the ground. With deregulation, we're going to see production increase even to an even greater degree. But we're going to need particularly private landowners working to plant these trees and get them in the ground so that critters can do their job. This is a picture. These are some red squirrels in Maine that forgot about their cache of chestnuts. And so that's eventually what we want, right? We want to plant trees. Do we cover 1% of the range? Do we cover 10% of the range? It's going to be something like that. We need you guys out there planting so that the critters can do their job and get them around. Some habitat's not going to be suitable for planting. This is the rocks that I know you guys who work in northern New Jersey, I know you guys are familiar with. I've seen these two scenes of planting on rocks. We got a lot of that in Pennsylvania too. So a lot of this is going to be, we're not going to be able to plant it. We need to be able to plant it in areas that then allow the things like Allegheny wood rat to move it into those locations to where chestnut used to be really plentiful, and that's one of their favorite habitats. This is what I call a rock dump tree. Look like a rock dump, but chestnuts can grow really well in this kind of environment, but I don't want to be planting in that. I hope that the critters will do that for me. Some things that, we don't know everything we know about resistance. There's still lots of questions, that we're working on. This is stuff that private landowners can work on, that we can work on with academics, that we can work on with folks like New Jersey Conservation Foundation or the Audubon Society or the Nature Conservancy or the U.S. Forest Service, or, there's lots of different folks who are working on questions like this. And we've got a long time to work on them. I think, a lot of people say, well, am I going to plant in gaps? Do I plant in clear cuts? Do I plant, monocultures of chestnut? Do I plant them with other species? And I say, yes, all of that, because the job ahead of us is so big. It's going to take all of these different methods to get the tree back in the forest and start to make an impact. So hopefully we get back to chestnuts making impact and being, instead of functionally extinct, functionally functional in the forest again. All right, I like to end on this slide. Gifford Pinchot, I wish I could come back in 100 years and see my trees. This is a multi-generational project. We're going to see some fruits of our labor, but most of this is for future generations, not just future generations of people, but future generations of trees working to get back into the forest. And I'll stop there and see if we have any questions.
Wonderful, thank you. And we did have some people that gave the right answer.
Oh,
actually, the first one. So
fantastic.
Mike, yep, is all good. So we have a great educated audience out there. So so Andy, I'm going to start with some of the questions in the chat, and then we could pop over to the Q&A together. Okay. So let me see. One of the first questions, and you did address this with the sandy soil, but Nicole was wondering, when you find a chestnut now, what type of soil do they seem to prefer? Acidic, alkaline, wet, dry, rocky? We kind of addressed that a little bit.
Yep. North,
south, east, west, slopes. Can you give us an idea?
Good, all good questions. So slopes don't seem to make a difference. Definitely sandy, rocky, well-drained soils, acidic. if you find blueberries, rhododendron, mountain laurel, you're apt to find chestnuts. That's not exclusively where they are, though. We do find chestnuts in coves, like hemlock coves. I don't know how many of those are actually in New Jersey, but they are in Pennsylvania. We can find chestnuts growing side by side with hemlock coves. And a lot of this of where chestnut will grow versus where chestnut is found, that's a bit of an issue too, because in really rich sites, mesic sites where chestnut probably would grow if I planted it and they would grow, they have been extirpated because they've been outcompeted by other stuff. They're at an extreme disadvantage on these moderate sites for them. So they're left to only the best sites for chestnut. So we know what the best site is for chestnut, but we don't know exactly where they would grow were they not disease susceptible. But where you're going to find them is well-drained acidic soils between 25% and 75% sand, but usually between that range. So more than 75% sand, it's usually a little too dry. Less than 25% sand, it's usually a little too wet. In our modeling, we find that explains 25% of where trees are found. So that's a huge percentage of explanation. Aspect doesn't seem to make a difference. It's mainly drainage and permeability, how fast water moves through the soil.
Fantastic. You mentioned a couple companion plants. Are there any others that they seem to be like to be by? And then second part of that question from Nicole is any fungi that support them? Fungi in a good way.
Yeah. So white pine tends to nurse hardwoods along, and so if you find white pine, you won't always find chestnut, but they do like to hang out with one another, and white pine certainly gets the soil ready. They acidify it. They break up some hard pan and things that hardwoods and chestnut in particular really like. So white pine, your ericaceous species, your blueberry, your mountain laurel. Like I said, at some of these hemlock coves, you can find chestnut. They will grow with other species, but those are the major guys that they are seen with. The major trees that they're seen with. Other fungi, I can't give you species names of fungi, but I will say, puffballs, which are typically, they are signs of mycorrhizal associations. Usually what I'll do is if I find a puffball at the base of a chestnut, I take that puffball and I squeeze it around other chestnuts, because that's going to be the mycorrhizae that is going to help, chestnuts grow. They are not required to make chestnuts grow, but they definitely help it grow better. So I can't give you any species names. I will say most of the commercial stuff available isn't for hardwoods. Most of it is for pine. So your best bet is to get puffballs or some duff from around native chestnuts and use that as a way to inoculate your own trees with good fungi.
Wonderful. I know we're going to get to ask this question a lot, and so maybe we can include it in the follow-up email. So if somebody was interested in maybe being a place for planting, because Beat wants to know, is it possible to get seedlings? So you would address that in a, you would visit the site and all that kind of stuff. So do we want to address that now, or do you want to include contact information in a follow-up email?
I'll address that now. I mean, I think I wish that we were at the point where you give me money and I give you trees. that would be the simplest exchange of goods for money. We're not quite there yet. So the easiest way to get seeds or seedlings is to join the American Chestnut Foundation. We don't sell them, we offer them. They're like our NPR mug or tote bag. If you join the foundation and become a sponsorship, instead of a tote bag, you get chestnuts. So that's the easiest way to get a seedling. If you join at the lowest level, you can have any wild type American chestnut seedlings you want. I will ship you a bag of 20, 50, 100 American chestnuts that you can start playing around with. They don't have any resistance. It's going to be like that Hahn orchard that you saw, but you also see that there's a lot of advantages to planting those. So if you want to get started, that's the easiest route to go. The least amount of me and you talking back and forth and figuring out how to get, what's going to be planted. The next, and that's the fewest number two. The next step are orchards. So we continue to do lots of research and breeding orchards. Because of the permitting and regulations and stuff, we can't plant the Darling 58 right now with partners. It's too much to deal with right now from the regulatory side of things. We hope to do that very soon. We're building up reserves to get these things released upon deregulation. So join now to get them the first. But if you want to plant a research orchard, you want to plant a GCO, you want to plant a breeding orchard of other kind of research material, usually it's at least 100 trees up to about 1,000 trees. We do a lot of back and forth. Is your land suitable? How much can you take care of it? We usually ask that it be fenced. Sometimes we have grant money for it. Sometimes we don't. That Lord Sterling planting, for example, it took us 5 years to find the funding to get that installed. And sometimes we don't find it for a long time, but we will work with you, and if the funding comes in or you just want to do it yourself, we'll work with you to put in a planting for research objectives. So we've got join and get sort of either a couple different kinds of small numbers of trees. We've got the research aspects of things, which require a little bit more of the landowner than just planting and walking away. Then we've got the reintroduction plantings, and that's probably what requires the most intense obligations of a landowner. That's where you're going to plant the best material that we have in the forest. It's going to require you to do lots of measurements, lots of feedback to us, but that's where you can potentially see some of the better material on the ground. But again, that's a research objective, but we need people working on that as well.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That's fantastic. Yeah. Andy, should we address some of the multitude of questions that are showing up in the Q&A?
The questions are coming in. Originally, there weren't too many, but there have been a bunch of them. Kind of following up on some of the other compatible items. Ann Van Heijs is asking, can they grow near black walnuts?
They can grow near black walnuts, but they're not going to grow well. So we had a planting in Indiana, actually, where they were growing right next to walnuts. And there's a couple reasons for that. So you guys all are familiar with the jugalone, the allelopathic chemical. So that has an effect. But really the bigger issue is that if you're growing black walnuts like really wet mesic sites, and chestnut doesn't. So if you see where a black walnut is growing, that's sort of an indicator that that's not a great site for chestnut. Will they grow? Yes. Will they grow well? Not so much. So yes, it can happen, but I'd recommend finding a drier site.
Ann was also asking about protection from deer for the ones you plant, and I might suggest if anybody wants to go to that Lord Sterling Park, you can see where there were a couple things they did in that one. I guess I'm answering for you, but you have to have fence tall enough to keep the deer out, because as Sara told me once upon a time, chestnut is like candy to deer. They really love it. So you've got to keep the deer off, and yes, you do need to put fences around them. But if I remember correctly, you also need the tubes at the bottom to keep the rodents off it as well.
Yeah, so the tubes at the base, and I don't know if I have any pictures. I don't remember if that was in this talk or not. I'll search through this while I'm talking. But the fencing, absolutely, particularly in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, fencing it's not absolutely required. And the woven wire there at Lord Sterling, that's the primo, that's the Cadillac, or whatever it is the kids buy these days of excellent fencing. You can definitely get by. Here's the black plastic fencing. A lot of our collaborators use this. It is a little bit cheaper. It doesn't last quite as long, but it is a little bit cheaper of an installation. It's easier to maintain. You see these trees all have this tube here at the base. Again, not required, but okay, let me get back. It is required of seed planting. If you put a chestnut, which all of these are, so this particular picture, all of these were a chestnut put in the ground. If you just do that without any protection, it will be gone literally within a couple of hours. I've done that experiment. I don't recommend it unless you just want to feed your squirrels. But so if you're going to do seed in the ground, you definitely need those tubes. If you do seedlings, you don't absolutely need them. I like them. It protects the base of the stem from things like groundhogs and herbicide. If you use that as a weed control agent, there are reasons to do it. There are also reasons if planting seedlings that you don't need it. But yeah, it's an investment. It's an investment of getting trees in the ground, particularly if you want all of them to live. If you don't care, if all of them live, and some people don't. I've done plantings where we just plant a bunch and hope that a few of them live. And if that's good for you, we can work with that too.
Yeah, I think that probably answers Jim Kilgore's question. He was wondering if chestnuts can be widely dispersed by helicopters.
Yeah, so
it could be, but they're not going to, the critters are going to get them.
So here's where did I put that picture? It wasn't a very good picture because you didn't really have the back. Oh, here we go. So here on the left, this is y'all can't tell what's going on here. But here's a chestnut stem here. It's growing in some milkweed. Here's a chestnut right here. Here's a chestnut right here. Here's a plate. Here's a chestnut right here. Here's a place where we direct seeded 40,000 chestnuts in a 1 acre area, and 10% came up. So you can do it, but it takes a whole lot more chestnuts than most people can get their hands on. Most of the time, you're just going to be feeding the wildlife. You might get 1 or 2 with enough to overwhelm it, but it takes a ton. So yes, and we're looking for ways to improve it. And I love, like, a lot of the folks in the Midwest are doing more and more direct seeding, and eventually we might have the kind of seed production to get there. But it's sometimes it's easier just to protect one tree than to plant 40,000.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, there's another one from Wendy. This is a good one, and I know Clark is on, but he's not. He's muted. I would really like to volunteer in northern New Jersey. Where are there opportunities, and how can I connect with a group?
Good question. So yeah, Clark is now in Colorado, but used to be there in northern New Jersey. We have a planting in Stoke State Forest, and that's actually a Chinese chestnut research plantation. We do plantings, or we do work up there to take measurements and things and review that planting. And then the Lord Sterling planting, we have a couple plantings in Morris County. I don't know if that's close enough, but in Schooley's Mountain is one of our other plantings, and we could definitely use some volunteer help there. Email me. I'm Sara, Sara, at ACF, American Chestnut Foundation.org, Sara at acf.org. Email me and I'll get you hooked up with some local folks, or you can just join our general list and find out about opportunities throughout the state and Pennsylvania as they arise.
Yeah, the listserv, right? Is that what you're talking when you said general list? Yeah, that's very, very helpful. That you find out where you need help, what's going on and stuff like that. Because I get those emails. It's pretty interesting. So cool. That's great. Schooley's Mountain's right up the road from me, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just try to finish up some of the questions in the chat. We still have a little bit of time left. So you mentioned I hope I'm saying this right, the Wanacue reservoir area. So Doug wants to know how he can locate the chestnut trees that are there. Are they marked, or is there like a guide? No.
We rarely mark them, and we don't typically make the locations known. We have had trees stolen. We have had trees cut down. I did a planting with 4th graders in central New Jersey. This was in 2016, 2015 timeframe. We planted them and they got ripped up the next day. So
sad.
We tend to not publicize that, but Wanacue Reservoir in particular, I do have the forester who found that. I know that he would be happy to take you out if you were interested in that and show you where they're at, but we won't publicize them.
Okay, that stays between us, people, for sure.
The Lord Sterling, where there are so many, I don't know how many hundred of trees were planted at Lord Sterling, but also in Lord Sterling, if I remember correctly, each tree or each row of trees was defined by what it was. I guess it was a hybrid between American and Chinese, but there were different levels.
Percentages, right?
Yeah. Correct.
But I've got to get over there. It's been a while since I've been over there, but that would be a good place for people to go to see what they look like.
Yeah, so that planting's 11, 12 years old now. Clark might be able to correct me because he was there, and but yeah, that has turned in. I think we're at about 30% survival now, which is pretty typical long term. Our typical long term survival is 30 to 50%. Of all of our orchards. And that seems to be pretty typical of hardwood plantations in general, what I see in other species as well, unless you're being unfair and you live in Indiana. We just won't talk about that because their soil is like 10 feet deep and it's like deep and rich and beautiful and gorgeous. But when you're planting in rocks, that you get a little bit of a different effect. Yeah, so their survival, and they've got some trees that are pretty substantial, and certainly creating chestnuts too. That fence is locked, so most of our plantings are not locked, but that one is so public that they do keep that behind lock and key.
We might need to do another field trip. It's been, like we said, what, 10 years at least. So maybe we need to do another field trip out there. So we'll think about that if we can make that happen.
Yeah.
So Jonathan was saying that, we talked about Tree Snap, and a great place to help you guys identifying where trees are. He wanted to know if there are any other apps besides Tree Snap. And I know we had a backyard forestry, and they talked about iNaturalist. Does that do you get that information, or is that not available to you?
I do get that information. It doesn't have as much info as Tree Snap does. So for example, on Tree Snap, it asks you the size of the tree, whether or not it's flowering. It tells you a way to send us a sample so we can verify it's an American chestnut. I find in iNaturalist, there's a lot of stuff that's not chestnut. There's a lot of stuff that's not American chestnut, and the group, the crowd is working to try and refine that. There is a part of our New York chapter of the Chestnut Foundation. They have formed their own Long Island group within iNaturalist, and they curate that particular area. So only Long Island trees. They do a really great job of curating that particular geographic location. So that has become a really treasure trove of good information and data. But when I'm on the data, it really helps me to go by size and flowering, because those are the trees that I'm going to hone in on for the work that we're doing, versus just here's a tree, which is helpful. But Tree Snap gives me a more robust data set that I can directly use.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Let's see. Wendy had a question about a chestnut sapling that she found about 3 inches in diameter on a trail near her house in Randolph. So we're still north. So does that mean there are other trees nearby? I mean,
maybe,
could be, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, usually, especially in that northern New Jersey area, where you find one, you're going to start finding quite a few around it. In southern Jersey, usually they are one-offs. So you find. So I don't know if you remember, there are a couple of points way down in the state, and that's like one tree. I can't remember the name of the town, but one tree behind the volunteer fire department. And that's it. And then there's one tree on the wildland preserve, and that's it. So they tend to get few and far between in South Jersey, but in North Jersey, they tend to be much more populous.
Okay. Sarah, I'm going to put your email address in the chat for everybody. So it's Sara at acf.org.
Just ACF.
Okay.
Yep. I have several, but that's the easiest to say.
Got it. Got it. Sara at acf.org. It's in the chat if people need that. And then Andy, we should probably try to wrap up some of the questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Interesting one from Terrence. What species took over the space occupied by chestnut trees? Oaks?
Yep, pretty much. That's a good question. It was primarily oaks, mainly because of the mass production, and the chestnut was so plentiful that it opened up the canopy for oaks to take over. They were in the right place at the right time. Really, they were hanging out in the understory. Chestnut declined, and oaks really took off after that.
Now, along that same vein, Philip has a question. Acorn take a year underground before sprouting. Can we plant chestnuts? And if so, do they require a similar period before sprouting, or will they sprout the following spring?
They sprout the following spring. And so like red oak, so white oak can do the next year. Red oak requires about a year, sometimes 2 of dormancy. You can keep them a little bit longer because of, we think, the tannin content. But chestnut, really needs, I won't say has to be planted the next year. So you harvest in September, October, you overwinter. It doesn't 100% require a cold period, but it's easier to store them that way. But you know, if you harvest in September, October, you plant in a pot in January, they're good to go. But they after about 2-3 months in storage of cold storage, they'll start sprouting. It's very difficult to keep them a second winter. You can, but your viability goes way down.
Yeah, Clark had a good follow-up to that too, that when the oaks replaced the chestnuts 100 and some years ago, we didn't have the deer population that we have now. The deer are going to really
They hammer
they'll
them.
go after the chestnut, but they'll go after the oaks as well.
Yep.
So we got to do something about the deer population.
We're gonna get in. We're gonna create an alliance with the cougar and wolf people to try and get the deer reduced.
That's about it, right?
Yep.
So Peg wanted to know, she remembers as a child that an area that was full of chestnuts, Berks County near the Blue Mountains,
Yep.
Wernersville, whatever.
Yes.
Any of them still there? Is
They
that
are.
Oh,
they are. And in fact, we have a
Fantastic.
planting in Wernersville right up from the state hospital. We put a planting in with DCNR in 16, I think. And yeah, you can still find quite a few chestnuts in those mountains. There, I don't know of any big notable trees, but definitely lots of sprouts hanging out in the understory.
Wonderful. So Norm, hi Norm. He wants to know, he has a bearing Chinese chestnut tree. He says trees, so that's plural.
Yeah.
Does that mean the American chestnut will do well?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
do they cross-pollinate?
They do. They
Okay.
do. So they flower at different times. So American chestnuts, so Chinese chestnuts typically come out first. They put their males out, then they put their females out. Then Americans come out, they put their males out. So usually when you get crossing, you have Chinese female flowers ready at the same time that American chestnut male flowers are ready, and that's usually how the crossing occurs, if it does. There are other incompatibilities. They're different species, right? So, you know, think about when you cross a horse and a donkey and you get the mule, you know, that's often what happens with those crosses. You get some genetic incompatibilities or even sterility and things like that. Chinese chestnuts typically can handle wetter soils than American chestnuts. So I won't say 100% that if you have Chinese chestnuts, American chestnuts will do well there, but it's a good bet. But again, I would check to make sure that the permeability is high and your drainage is good. Most likely an American chestnut will do well there.
Wonderful. So Anne had a question about the virus that we're working with to kill the fungus. Will that transfer to other fungi at all, or no?
It's really hard to get it. The reason it's not doing really good for us is because it's really hard to get it to transfer between the chestnut fungus, between chestnut blight fungi. So it will, and it can, but it's very hard. So hypoviruses are very, very, very specific. So it's the reason that a lot of the hypervirus stuff got funded was because there are similar things that happen in humans and other animals, and there are breaking that down in chestnut blight and how it works there, and sequencing, you know, all that was easier than working in humans at the time. So a lot of that work has been applicable to other kingdoms, but for it to jump, there are no documented accounts of chestnut hypervirus jumping, and it's highly unlikely.
Okay. And then an anonymous attendee, AA, if you will, wanted to ask about native insects. And are there any plans of using native insects really to proof the finished species within the native environment? Like, can they help you at all in this, or have you considered that?
Can native insects help us?
Yeah, with keeping the chestnuts.
Probably. You know, I don't know exactly in what way other than from a pollination standpoint. So chestnuts tend to be wind pollinated, but we do know that chestnuts, that bees collect pollen. You've got soldier beetles all over those flowers during pollination period. So there is some insect pollination that occurs. And then obviously we're really concerned about feeding the insects, that we want our trees to be able to feed them. So my concern typically is more about what can the chestnuts do for the insects and vice versa. But I'm sure that there's a place for them. A couple interesting notes is that since this work's begun and more chestnuts are being planted in the landscape, some species thought to be extinct, they probably weren't extinct, but that were thought to be extinct are now being seen again. So there was a chestnut bee that was recently found in Maryland that's now being seen up into New England. We're doing scouting for that. So, I think as you get more and more of these trees back on the landscape, you might find more and more of these thought to be extinct insect species, and that's really that is amazing and is why I love doing this work.
Yeah, that is really cool. That's good stuff. Do they use drones for that? Like you showed that picture up in Maine about that one solitary chestnut tree that stood out.
Yeah.
Do they use drones to try to locate things like that?
So that was planes, and we had a big old call this spring about drones versus planes. How do we get satellite imagery in on this, because there is pretty amazing technology out there. Drones can be used. People do use drones. It's not as easy to use drones as a plane. You don't get to cover as much area, and there are certain other regulations and restrictions that make drones less utilitarian than planes. But absolutely, if people have a drone and they want to do it and they want to find especially flowering trees, have at it. And we're definitely interested in working with folks who have experience working with satellite imagery, LiDAR, stuff like that. All of that can be technologies in the right hands that we can use to find more and more trees.
Wonderful. I think we need to provide our members in our email e-newsletters, if you will, some updates as to some of the stuff that you are doing and some of the needs that you have. So you and I should talk on a regular basis and try to make sure we put something into our members. So Andy, is there anything else in the Q&A or the chat that you wanted to address before we wrap it up?
To follow up on some of the, because I know Sarah and I several years ago, Sarah toured our property and we looked for appropriate sites to do plantings. Could you give us a little bit more information on what's involved in either getting the American chestnut or the hybrids? Now, do we contact the American Chestnut Foundation, contact you? What's involved in actually getting seedlings or nuts?
Right. So if you join, like I said, the tote bag chestnut, those are seedlings. They're provided to sponsor members of the foundation, and that's easy. You go on the website, you join. You can just click a button to join at the sponsorship level. And if you join before February, you'll get your seedlings in March, April, May timeframe. That's the easiest, path of least resistance method, and doesn't involve me. If you want wild American chestnuts, so that sponsor tree, those may have resistance. We can't guarantee it. That's why I can't just sell you trees, because we have no guarantee of what this material is going to do yet. It may have resistance, it may not, but it by becoming a sponsor member, you're supporting the research and helping us get to our end goal. And if you join, the first people to get the best trees are going to be members, and we work on a longevity basis. The longer you've been a member, you get the trees first. If you want wild type seeds, become a member and then contact my office. So I work at Penn State for and with the Pennsylvania New Jersey chapter. We always give away seeds in the spring. If you want to drive to the spring meeting, which we haven't decided where that's going to be, if it's going to be in person, we give nuts away at that meeting. So you can drive home with a bag of nuts that day, should you wish. If you can't make it, then we'll mail it out to you. So again, those are wild type, no resistance, but great to plant for a variety of reasons, and to just learn how to plant the species. I think that there's as we prepare for material that's improved, that is disease resistant, I'd rather you guys practice on a ton of stuff that is expendable and gets expended than use material that takes a lot more effort to create. If you want to plant an orchard, if you want to do research with us, then contact me directly. And but that requires a lot more involvement.
Great.
Wonderful. So thank you. I have one comment that Doug made, and this may stem from your introduction because he wants to know when we are going to have a plan to do a tree and pub crawl. I really like that idea, a tree and a pub crawl. So think about that.
Go to a pub, see an awesome tree, go to another pub, see another awesome tree. That sounds like an awesome idea.
It sounds like a good deal, definitely. So
you have to make t-shirts for that too. Coming from Penn State where they do that, every
Yeah.
week. You gotta have a
Oh,
t-shirt
my.
made up for your phone
Gotta have a
call.
t-shirt. Okay. All right. We'll work on that for sure.
Yep.
All right. I think we're good. Just glad everybody came tonight. I hope it was informative. Sarah, thank you. This was fantastic. We definitely need to stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, like we said, if there's any resources that you would like for me to include in the follow-up email, just send them my way. I'll make sure to include them, links, documents, whatever.
Okay.
And appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody that was here today. And again, we'll see you in September, hopefully, and we'll send an announcement on Woodland Stewards program that's coming up, and then also the next backyard forestry program. So I hope everybody
great.
has a good night.
Thanks,
Sarah,
everyone.
Great seeing you again.
Yeah, you too. All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Okay.
Take
bye-bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye.